Writers, readers, drinkers, lend me your ears and your livers. Welcome to Writers Drinking Whiskey Open Bar, the boozy author panel where we dive deep into the liquor and into the writing topics of today. From writing craft to writing life, pop culture, and the rest. I am your host and resident object lesson, William R. Hincy, and we've got a great panel tonight. So, characters based on people you know in your life. So how do you manage characters based on real people, fiction or nonfiction? And, specifically, I'm thinking like sensitive subject matter, potentially painting someone in not so positive of a light, maybe not necessarily negative, just maybe a light that they want to enjoy. How do you manage those real world relationships with keeping your writing bold, honest, and true?
I always like it when I hear writers or people teaching writing talk about honesty and truth. John Gardner has a whole chapter on it in his book. It's important, and it's a good question. I've kind of come across this. I think, first of all, you're going to run it through a blender if you possibly can. To the point where it's barely recognizable, or at least you can't get sued or, lose a friendship. Bill, that my first and really only very successful book was a memoir of a year I spent in Greece. And thank goodness for the First Amendment, which is very, very robust. Because some people didn't like my reporting exactly what was said. But that was a memoir. In fiction, we all draw upon reality. We all draw upon characters we know. I guess, I've never been in the position of really wanting to write about a very difficult incident or aspect of someone. I guess you could ask them if you minded putting it into fiction, but bottom line is, if it's going to really hurt someone or screw up a friendship, I'd steer clear of it. But generally, you can run through things through a blender enough that they lose their association.
Sure. That makes sense. I think, and you mentioned there maybe asking. Right. And I think, and I know other authors that have done that, right? Like, so I'm writing this, can you read it and then tell me what you think, right? And I always wonder about that is that you probably need to, one, express how much leeway do you have? Like, how much veto power? Right? Like the government, like, okay, I'm going to run this law up to you. How much? Like... You're the commander in chief and you just veto this, or is it something that that I think I need to keep, And so when I was, and this is actually how Dario and I met.
Discontinuity, right?
Discontinuity. Yeah. Oh no. Just not that one in particular. That one was really fictionalized, but we met when I was redoing the novel that started life as The Hordes of Torment. I had a horrible publishing experience, and this has to be a topic for one of these open bars, but not today's, but horrible publishing experience with a traditional publisher. Years later, I'm like, okay, this, and I'd met multiple other writers that they had worse experiences even than I did. So I reached out and said, hey, can I just have the book back? It's no harm done. I'll call it a day. Can just say you're good with me having the rights, and I'll go my pleasant way. They said, yay. I also may have threatened a little bit, but they gave me the thumbs up. And so when I redid it worked out fairly well because it started off very, and we'll see if I can hit this word because it is the word that challenges my vocabulary more than others. Autobiographical. I always want to say audio biographical because I think I'm musical. And but so when I got it back, and then I really went through, but the whole novel, which is now But the Ripping Apart, started with a real world thing that when Claire and I, my now wife, were dating, she had a teacher and she asked me, "Hey, can you go?" And we were friends for a long time, and so we're dating, but this is very early dating, and so probably did it more just as my friend. It was like, do you mind checking in on her? Right? Because this is not a date activity, right? And we went, and the lady was a hoarder and an alcoholic and was struggling. And the reason she wanted to go check on her was because ironically she had phone books stacked in the living room, and she lost her phone when one of them collapsed. So when Claire tried to call her, she couldn't get a hold of her because her phone was just off the hook, right? And anyone that just knows cell phones, no, it doesn't just go to voicemail. Back in the day, it just went beep, 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 beep. And you're like, what the hell's happening? Like, I can't get these people. And when she first read that book, because I hadn't run it by her, because I had fictionalized so much to where the character that Erica, that would be the stand-in for my wife, like does not like in any way, like she's so fictionalized that is not my wife. And I don't think I could actually capture a real human in all their complexity just in my writing, and because we're not stagnant. So when you write, it's necessarily stagnant. But when she read it, she did start having a lot of questions about what was real, what really happened, this and that. And it did feel like I was like, oh, I didn't manage this well. It was one of my takeaways is I didn't manage this well because she saw it, and thought something way different than what I intended, Yeah. So Matt, Dan, you guys have any experience with that or any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the blender, I've never heard that before. I think it's a genius way of phrasing it, like to kind of muck it up a little bit. As a fiction writer, primarily, I obviously write poetry, kids' books, but it's all kind of fictionalized, right? I've written a few essays, but never anything. I tend to write like happier essays about how my parents met because they have this fascinating story, or about a funny date. So I never have any fear that the person isn't going to like it. It's actually a pretty flattering piece. But I have had that with fiction, a little bit like you with But the Ripping Apart. It's kind of, I sometimes switch it up so much. Like you were saying, I obviously named location, physical features. I even do gender many times. If gender isn't that important to the story, I switch it up. I was going through a really devastating period of grief in my early 20s, where I had lost a bunch of people who really mattered to me kind of in succession. And I ended up writing Los Angeles, my first book, LOSS, because it was bound by the city I grew up in and the theme of loss. But I remember even some of those painful stories that happened to me, I was just like, oh, I'm too close to this. So if I switch this 28-year-old man to a 15-year-old girl who also loses someone that really matters, how does that change the grief? It really doesn't. But now I can write from just a little bit more of a fictionalized place, and I'm not trying to remember all the details that were impactful to me and things like that. So yeah, kind of looking at all the physical characteristics down the line and seeing what you can tweak and how much you can kind of dial them up, right? If does this person need to be a 42-year-old man? If this person's a 22-year-old woman just going to grad school or something, does that change your story? If it really doesn't for fiction, then I think you're golden, right? Someone will sometimes tell you a plot. I've had a friend tell me an interesting plot or something that happened to her parents once. I was like, oh, I need to write about that. But I obviously want to protect my friend. So we change everything, But
you're saying the core truth is there under the changes.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think
I love
the core truth and the meaning of the story, the power of the story is still very much there. Yeah, that's what's essential.
Sure. Well, and that might be a great question of, is it worth telling? Right? Does it have that core truth? Can I just change this to whatever it is? female, male, what, like, can I change a few details in the primary story? Is that still worth it, worth telling?
Yeah,
Like,
it's the advantage of fiction, right? Like if you're writing a memoir, the idea is you're going in and you're kind of doing some truth telling, but with fiction,
yeah. Well, and I think that like everything doesn't have to be a memoir, right? I think there's too much memoirs. Like I know 50% of the audience just tuned out and was like, I had my memoir, this son of a. But and Dario, I loved yours. Aegean Dream, I think it was really brilliant. But just because it happened doesn't mean it's story. So there might be things that happen that are a story, and then can you fictionalize those, or even if it's a memoir, but how do you handle those in a way that is a story? How do you tell a story based on what happens? Dan, do you have any thoughts you want to take it from there?
I mean, I would, I think I would just kind of reiterate, ditto and two thumbs up to what Dario and Matt said, and you. I love the phrase "run things through a blender," and that's hadn't ever thought of things quite in those terms, but that's when I've written nonfiction. I do write about some uncomfortable things and people who are close. That is one strategy that I have used for distance. Another, frankly, I wait till people die. And that's, that's
I love it. You can do that because you're young.
It's,
or kill them.
Or murder them.
And then kill them.
Then
you got
a core truth there. Yeah. And you got a real story that
that's what the show was about.
And your ending is taken care of. Yeah.
Yes. You've got everything all at once. But if I'm hanging out in your driveway and you're not feeling well and I've got my pad and paper, trouble's coming. But it does kind of, it makes it easier, when people are not there, once they're gone, to write about the dead. But it is, even still, you do want to kind of, keep things, even with uncomfortable things, I try to keep some kind of balance, and I do think about how I try to imagine how they would perceive that, and while still, keeping the core truth or telling keeping the hard details intact, the real details. I do try to nuance things and try to, give some, at least some sense of their side of things, of why they might have behaved that way. But
well, and I think that's important, is that even in my fiction, this goes back, but I don't think of characters as the antagonist and the protagonist, right? I gotta think of, we're all the same. Like I'm the antagonist. Like my kids would tell you I'm the antagonist in their story, and I would be like the protagonist and the noble father trying to parent these ruffians into adulthood. But I think when you're writing about someone, especially even if they passed, right? Like if you take that moment, you take that beat and go, how did they see this? I can actually enrich your storytelling that much more.
Absolutely.
Right? So if it's like, oh, my dad passed, I'm going to tell this story. Well, if you take a second and go, well, I wonder how he thought about this, like coming from his background, from the society he was born into, right? We love to go for the modern audience, right?
Yeah.
They're all for modern audiences. Whatever he did was for a modern audience. Modern audience is no one and everyone all the same, right? Like it's just whoever's alive at that moment.
Yeah.
And it makes sense when you think about it and you go, oh, well, you know what? They thought of this differently. But maybe I can incorporate that into it so that it doesn't just seem like they're a horrible person. It seems like they're from a different time.
Yeah. And that's that imaginative empathy is crucial for the writer to have, and it's also Dario was talking about the reader on the page too. That's right. Also gets the reader involved, and they need to have that as well, and evokes that.
Sure, empathy is the word. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think again it's John Gardner. I think there are only two writing books other than mine. One of them is Stephen King's Little on Writing, and the other is John Gardner's The Art of Fiction. And Gardner talks about sterility when the writer can't empathize or feel the emotion or be compassionate. And it's a really good word. It's kind of emotional sterility.
You're right.
Oh, that's lovely. Because I think of it in Dario, we've talked about this before, but I always think of it as if when I'm writing something, I don't feel like I've bled for it. And I don't mean that literally, right? Not that I'm literally bleeding, but I mean that emotionally, right? Not figuratively, emotionally. Like if I have not bled for that thing, like I think But the Ripping Apart is probably, from a craft point of view, my worst work, right? It's my first novel. I wrote tons of short stories, probably craft-wise not on the par as a lot of my short stories and things, but I bled for that. And I think it comes out even now. There's moments that I think just really shine, that really capture a scene, emotion, a person, a time, as it happened in all its bloody glory. And I think when you bring up other people, that becomes hard because I'm willing to sacrifice that, but I don't want to sacrifice my wife for that, right? There's an altar I'm on as a writer. I can sacrifice, and I get to choose how much I sacrifice, right? Like I'll bleed, but I'm not giving up the ghost. But how much I don't want my wife to bleed. I don't want my mom or my dad to bleed, right? So when I write things, like I wrote the Christmas satirical anthology.
I was just thinking of that.
And the first story is very like, the action in that story happened. Everything else did not happen. But my mom's kind of a crazy person. My dad's the hillbilly. My dad's actually not even, my mom's more of a hillbilly than my dad was. But they become just farcical characters. I don't worry about it. They're not bleeding. I hope they would never think like that was actually them, because it's silly and it's satirical for a reason. But when you're writing it, I don't want to then subject my wife to feeling like she had to bleed for something that I did. And that's the hard part about it. So I love your idea, Dario, throwing it in a blender of, I think there is letting people read things and being careful about how much kind of veto power, they have with it. But I don't know that there's a right answer, but I think it's a fascinating question. Before we move on, Matt, Daniel, Dario, anyone else have any final thoughts?
I think that's good.
Yeah.
I think
if
we
you
solved
thought that
it.
Was good, Matt. I believe it. I think we solved it. You're right.
Yes.
Yeah. We solved this.
Yeah. We did.
Thanks for tuning in. If you have a subject you'd like us to cover or something you'd like us to do a deeper dive into, drop us a comment. We'd love to include it on a future episode. The show is a labor of fun, and it's truly a reward in its own right. But if you would like to support me or the other amazing authors I have on there, consider picking up a book. Any of the writers we have on here would be a great addition to your bookshelf. Each one is a master storyteller and just a great person to boot, so you'd be doing them and yourself a great favor in picking those up. And while I would never call myself a master, because that would be, as we said in the 90s, conceited, I do have on a pretty good authority from critics and my mom alike that I'm not bad. So if you wouldn't mind picking up one of my books, that would be great as well. I would appreciate it. Thanks again for watching, and thanks to my great panel of guests for coming on and spending this time with us. Cheers.